Hi everyone, it's Ms. Cary, and today we're going to look at Module 10, the late 1950s through the late 1960s.
Module 10, the late 1950s through the early 1960s, Part 1. Jazz as Art and Political Expression in the Civil Rights Movement. We will start with this disturbing picture from the Civil Rights Movement of a civil rights protester being attacked by police dogs. The late 1950s through the early 1970s represented a time of significant political and social change in America. The Cold War was in full swing, with tensions escalating between the USSR and the United States, as both world powers vied for domination of their political ideals, communism for the former and democracy for the latter, respectively. With the advent of nuclear weaponry, total annihilation was a looming threat at every moment. A new generation of baby boomers, Americans born shortly after the Second World War, would experience one of the most divisive generational transitions in the nation's history, rejecting previously held social norms. Two significant historical occurrences during this period, the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, significantly impacted the attitudes and beliefs of Americans, especially young adults. The first of these was the Vietnam War. The United States became involved between 1961 and 1975 in hopes of hindering the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The counterculture movement of the late 1960s, perhaps best epitomized by the hippies of this generation, is a direct reaction to the Vietnam War, a military campaign that cost the lives of over 58,000 Americans. Rock and roll and folk music were two genres that transformed the American musical scene, with numerous artists writing protest songs in reaction to an unnecessary and violent war. Here we see a famous 60s folk musician on the left, Pete Seeger, and on the right, the great rock and roll guitarist, Jimi Hendrix. However, division existed among jazz musicians in regards to public reaction towards the war. In an era when jazz was being recognized as an art as American as apple pie, many ensembles, including Louis Armstrong and the Dave Brubeck Quartet, were sent abroad to promote democracy with music that the government recognized as representing freedom. The overwhelming irony is that many of the significant jazz musicians of this period were African American, fighting in the civil rights movement for equal rights while performing as the poster child for American democracy abroad. For this reason, the civil rights movement was more closely aligned with jazz music through the 1950s and 1960s, with a plethora of artists, both black and white, utilizing jazz music as an agent of social change. The civil rights movement began in 1954 with the Supreme Court ruling that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Brown versus Board of Education. and culminated with the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965. Two important pieces of federal legislature offering African Americans the same rights and protection as white Americans. It is important to recognize that many other significant events happened prior to and regarding this 11-year period, including the assassination of visionary civil rights leaders Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. But the period of greatest activity and accomplishment on the national level occurred between 1954 and 1965. Here you see an African American woman who is now allowed to go to school in a non-segregated school, and the people harassing her as she's walking to school because they wanted things to stay segregated. The significance of jazz in the civil rights movement is not surprising when we consider the numerous examples of the music acting as a voice for African Americans. While jazz has long been a syncretic genre, borrowing largely from a plethora of cultures, its most significant influence has been Black culture in America. You may recall from earlier in our studies this semester that the first jazz musician, Buddy Bolden, used jazz as a means of illuminating police abuse towards African Americans in New Orleans. You may also recall how Billie Holiday's recording and performances of Strange Fruit in the early 1940s brought attention to the atrocities of lynching in the southern United States. These are just two of a multitude of notable examples where jazz became a means of exposing the injustices committed upon African Americans from the beginning of the 20th century right through the 1950s. It is clear that jazz music has long been an instrument of social change, but in the 1950s and 60s, we see this facet of the art form becoming increasingly prominent and influential in American culture, especially for African Americans. For many African American musicians, performing jazz music was more than a form of artistic expression. It was also a form of social protest and a way of peacefully protesting the systemic racism deeply embedded in the United States. In the 1950s, the musical heritage of African Americans was reflected in hard bop music of Horace Silver and Art Blakey, influenced largely by traditional genres such as the blues, gospel, and spirituals. One of the progenitors of the hard bop movement, Max Roach, from Module 8, shifted his attention towards politically charged music in the late 1950s, culminating in his album We Insist. Collaborating with a cast of legendary jazz musicians, including Coleman Hawkins and vocalist Abbey Lincoln, the album was created as a protest against the treatment of African Americans sitting in at a restaurant in Greensboro, North Carolina. Here we see the cover of We Insist, the album, and they're at the lunch counter, and on the right you see an actual photograph from one of the Greensboro sit-ins where only white people were allowed to sit at the lunch counter in the Woolworths store. So they decided to sit down and not get up, no matter what happened. And you can see what happened. People poured food on top of them. They yelled at them. They threw things at them and called them names. But they stood up for their civil rights. The racial tension of the time and the continued segregation and mistreatment of African Americans in the South is echoed in Abbey Lincoln's visceral singing and piercing tambourine hits on the track Drive-A Man. Both musical devices represent the struggle of the African American since the earliest days of slavery, with Lincoln's assertive vocals fighting back against the painful injustice of the plantation owner's whip. Written by Max Roach and Oscar Brown, Drive-A Man tells the explicit story of slavery through its lyrics and accompaniment. Nat Hentoff, who was present at the recording sessions of the album, wrote that Drive-A Man is a personification of the white overseer in slavery times, who often forced women under his jurisdiction into sexual relations. Also in the lyrics are patter-rollers. In Hentoff's liner notes, he includes a description of the patrollers by a former slave who says they are men who would catch you from home and wear you out and send you back to your master. Most of them were patrollers, was poor white folks. Poor white folks had to hustle around to make a living, so they hired out themselves to slave owners and rode the back roads at night and whipped you if they cast you off their plantation without a pass. The listening link for Drive-A Man, performed by Abbey Lincoln and the Max Roach Quintet from We Insist, is listed in your textbook, or you can find it online. Nina Simone. Like Roach and Lincoln, Nina Simone combined jazz with traditional African American genres to produce some of the most powerful and distinct protest songs recorded during the Civil Rights Movement. A native of Tryon, North Carolina, less than an hour south of Asheville, Simone struggled through the difficulties of living as an African American in the southern United States. In her autobiography, Simone recalls having to relocate during her childhood to the western North Carolina settlement of Lynn, a predominantly African American rural community so poverty-stricken that the Simone family was the first family to build an outside bathroom. Perhaps one of the most notable stories Simone recalls is when she gave her first piano recital and protested the treatment of her mother and father in a segregated community. Nina said, "When I was 11 years old, I was asked to give a recital in the town hall. I sat at the piano with my trained elegance while a white man introduced me, and when I looked up, my parents, who were dressed in their best, were being thrown out of their front row seats in favor of a white family I had never seen before. And Daddy and Mama were allowing themselves to be moved. Nobody else said anything, but I wasn't going to see them treated like that, and stood up in my starched dress and said if anyone expected to hear me play, then they'd better make sure that my family was sitting right there in the front row where I could see them. Simone's musical and political vision reflects this same intense emotional attitude, combined with a diverse blending of a classical piano training, singing gospel in her family's church, and listening to Billie Holiday's records. Simone's genre-defying compositions are unified by her raw, emotionally charged vocal delivery and dramatically intense piano style. One can hear elements of Southern black spirituals, Appalachian ballad singing, 19th century romantic piano, and the Delta blues, all fused in Simone's intimate yet powerful song, Brown Baby. Be sure to listen to Brown Baby with the link provided in your textbook. The song Mississippi Goddam is more than just a jazz gospel composition by Nina Simone. It is the artist's musical response to the tragic death of 4 African American girls killed in a bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, by white supremacists. Simone demonstrates her masterful storytelling, opening the song with an upbeat piano rhythm accompanying her recurring lyric, "Alabama's got me so upset," before transitioning into a contrasting section in a minor key. Simone's combination of written lyrics and improvised scat singing, as well as her incorporation of bent blues notes and call and response to evoke spirituals, are trademark elements of this significant artist's musical style. I would highly suggest listening to Mississippi Goddam. It's a powerful song, and the link is provided in your textbook. What many musicians and scholars tend to overlook, however, was that Nina was also an accomplished improviser who combined her knowledge of Baroque and classical music with her blues, jazz, and gospel background. One can hear her quote fragments of Bach during her solo in her famous recording of Love Me or Leave Me, which features both her distinctive vocal style as well as her technical virtuosity on the piano. There's a listening link for Love Me or Leave Me listed in your textbook. While revered as a social activist, songwriter, genre-defined performer, and civil rights leader, Simone's legacy as a jazz artist is often underemphasized in many jazz textbooks. This might be due to the fact that Simone was one of the most musically versatile artists of the 20th century, recording everything from straight-ahead jazz to blues to classically inspired ballads. Nina Simone's prolific catalog of music might often defy categorization, but her skill as both an improvising vocalist and pianist clearly positions her as a significant musical artist in the jazz canon. Charles Mingus. Few musicians embraced the political message of the civil rights movement with the same fervor as Charles Mingus. A brilliant multi-instrumentalist, most noted for his work as a bassist, but also a talented pianist and prolific composer. Mingus was also one of the most controversial and outspoken figures in jazz history. Mingus was acutely aware of the disparities created by the modern music industry, where jazz musicians, often black jazz musicians, were underpaid and not given due credit for their creative work. Additionally, jazz musicians were often relegated to the role of entertainer, their artistic ambitions pushed aside. Mingus saw these musical and cultural trends as reflections of wider social issues, including the homogenization of American society, the prevalence of white dominance in a society that was both subversively and overtly racist, and a society that promoted freedom yet did not wish to hear the individual opinions or views of others. Mingus's views were manifested in his creation of an independent record label, the Jazz Artists Guild, and his own publishing company, notable endeavors which ultimately failed. A passionate individual, Mingus was also known for his sometimes obscene and socially unacceptable behavior. In performance, he would fire band members in the middle of the concert, end songs abruptly, and even destroy his bass in performance. At one point, Mingus violently assaulted the talented trombonist Jimmy Knepper, causing irreversible damage to the musician's ability to play. As a result of the injury, Knepper's sound on the trombone changed, yet he was able to forgive Mingus and even continued working with the bassist. George Wayne, an impresario who worked closely with Mingus, described his behavior as erratic, stating, "He was as unpredictable a human being as I have ever known." Yet Mingus, for all his intermittent fits and psychological issues, he once asked his analyst to write liner notes for a song and admitted himself to a mental hospital. Was one of the most innovative and influential musicians in the history of jazz. His albums from the 1950s and 1960s are especially notable, large-scale works akin to the symphonies of great classical composers. Mingus defied categorization, fusing his experience as an accomplished bassist in the cool school with Lenny Tristano, bebop with Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, and West Coast scene with vibraphonist Red Norvo and guitarist Tal Farlow, among others. By the early 1950s, Mingus had established himself as one of the preeminent jazz bassists, but by the end of the decade, the multi-talented artist would become even more respected and well known as a visionary composer. This legacy began in 1956 when Mingus recorded and released the album Pithecanthropus Erectus, a musical masterpiece and socio-politically charged work. In his liner notes, Mingus outlined the fallacies of man. Overcome with self-esteem, he goes out to rule the world, if not the universe, but both his own failure to realize the inevitable emancipation of those he sought to enslave, and his greed in attempting to stand on a false security deny him not only the right of ever being a man, but finally destroy him completely. This powerful declaration, all the more relevant in light of the civil rights movement, is musically brought to life in the opening title track. The hypnotic insistency of the underlying bass line represents the story arc of mankind. The ascension of man from an ape on all fours to an upright hominid is marked by the growth spurts of accented rhythmic outbursts, marked by a hypnotic recurring bass line, representing the inevitable persistence of time. Shortly thereafter, a brief interlude of cacophony, representing war, rears its ugly head, only finally interrupted by a series of solos, marked with Mingus's insistent bass line. Here we see the cover for Pithecanthropus erectus, and on the right you see the actual artist rendition of the Java man, Pithecanthropus erectus, one of the earliest hominids who walked erect. Be sure to listen to the recording of the opening track, also called Pithecanthropus erectus, from the album by Charles Mingus, either on YouTube or by clicking on the link in your textbook. While Mingus is noted for his expansive creative vision in larger scale works, he also put out shorter works, which have since become standards in the jazz repertoire. Mingus was especially fascinated with the blues form, composing several compositions which followed the 12-bar length and structure of the blues, but diverging in innovative harmonic directions. In the following composition, Pussycat Dues, we hear elements of New Orleans jazz fused with the blues in a gritty style, which is idiomatic to Mingus's trademark sound. Be sure to listen to Pussycat Dues. Like many of the black musicians in the civil rights movement, Mingus emphasized traditional African American styles in his music. Gospel was an especially prevalent influence, with the out-of-body and spiritually transcendent energy and excitement of the black gospel tradition, heard in several works, including Better Get It in Your Soul, the opening track for what many consider to be his most significant album to date, Mingus Drummer Danny Richmond, who collaborated with Mingus for almost 2 decades, propels the track with his dynamic and high-energy gospel waltz feel. So be sure to listen to Better Get It in Your Soul from Mingus Mingus gained attention with the album for both its music as well as its political message. Of all the tracks, however, Fables of Faubus stands out as the most famous example. Mingus's musical protest letter to Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas was ultimately released as an instrumental, as the Columbia record label was concerned over the controversy it might cause. However, Mingus was nobly determined to get his song about Faubus's refusal to integrate the Arkansas public schools, and he released a vocal version on Candid Records a year later, in 1960, on Charles Mingus Presents Charles Mingus. So it would be an interesting comparison for you to check out both versions of the piece. The original one that came out first, Fables of Faubus, the instrumental version on and also Fables of Faubus on Charles Mingus Presents Charles Mingus, with the lyrics like 2, 4, 6, 8. They brainwash and teach you hate. It's definitely worth a listen. By the late 1970s, Mingus had established himself as one of the most important voices in jazz. Sadly, the now respected jazz artist had a limited time to enjoy the fruits of his labor. Diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease in 1977, the once virtuosic bassist was unable to play. Mingus's legacy, however, would live on and reach an even wider audience when he aligned himself with one of the most popular folk rock singer-songwriters of the day. Shortly before his death, Mingus collaborated with Joni Mitchell, producing an album of his music titled Mingus. Here we see Joni Mitchell. Sadly, Mingus did not live long enough to hear the finished product, but Joni, an accomplished jazz vocalist and one of the most important songwriters and composers of the 20th century, carried on the jazz great's legacy. When Mingus was released in June 1979, almost 6 months after Mingus's passing, it was a commercial flop. This was shortly remedied after Joni's extensive touring with an all-star jazz band. Mitchell introduced thousands of fans to both the brilliant work of Charles Mingus and jazz, a genre which, by the late 1970s, had largely become a niche genre. There's a track from the album, which is a powerful interpretation by Joni Mitchell of Mingus's moving masterpiece, Goodbye Pork Pie Hat. So be sure to listen to that, performed by Joni Mitchell. The link is in your textbook and can also be found on YouTube. Alto saxophonist and composer Ornette Coleman provided the most radical departure in 1959 with his release of the album The Shape of Jazz to Come. The dramatic title was not undeserved, as Coleman, along with musical collaborators Charlie Haydn on bass, Don Cherry on pocket cornet, a smaller version of the cornet, and Billy Higgins on drums, brought attention to a subgenre of jazz known as free jazz. You may recall from Module 8 that Lenny Tristano was the first musician to record free jazz, exactly a decade earlier with his recording of Intuition. However, this free jazz, also the title of Coleman's following album release a year later, was ultimately perfected and received public attention thanks to Ornette Coleman. The sometimes controversial genre emphasized total freedom from the underlying harmonic structure, focusing instead on melodic and rhythmic interaction and interplay. The elimination of the harmonic component liberated the musicians from the restrictive parameters of the song's chord progressions. What is perhaps the most ironic is that Coleman, like his musical partners, was deeply rooted in the now established bebop tradition, where the foundation of the changes, remember from Module 7, dictated a great deal of the improviser's structural material. The ornate melodic lines and sophisticated rhythms of bebop were ultimately retained by free jazz musicians, but could now flourish in an unimpeded setting where harmony was no longer a dictating force. On the surface, it would appear that the music represented an underlying political message, one that was congruent with the African American community's desire for equality and liberation from the oppressive legislation and mindset of a nation still dealing with the injustice of a slave-based economy that had ended less than a century earlier. Indeed, Coleman's music was often attributed to the civil rights movement, but Ornette, from the time of the album's release until the present day, has attested that free jazz was absolute music with no underlying social or political agenda. The groundbreaking new musical directions Coleman bravely forged were not a result of the civil rights movement at the time of the genre's inception. The listening link in your textbook is called Lonely Woman by the Ornette Coleman Quartet. And be sure to give that a listen to hear free jazz. Eric Dolphy. Here's an image of Eric Dolphy playing the flute. Eric Dolphy represents an important historical figure in American music, not only for his innovative musical contributions to jazz, but also for his position as an artist whose revolutionary music was often aligned with the civil rights movement. Eric Dolphy was forging a new sound for the modern woodwind performer. A multi-instrumentalist, Dolphy was a master of the more commonplace alto saxophone, as well as flute and bass clarinet. The latter instrument, a deeper-sounding member of the clarinet family, had been utilized in jazz before, largely in the context of an instrument which saxophonists and clarinetists might double on in a big band. But Dolphy mastered the bass clarinet, elevating it to the status of a solo instrument. This was only one of his many accomplishments musically. Possessing an amazingly sophisticated concept of harmony, Dolphy pushed the boundaries of what was possible in jazz improvisation. As we saw in Module 7, Charlie Parker had established a new approach, where the extensions of each of the chords in a jazz tune provided the foundation for the improviser. Dolphy elaborated on this, emphasizing the altered notes of these extensions to create a dissonant yet extremely melodic and aggressive sound. Indeed, he chose to emphasize and resolve his musical phrases on these altered notes, whereas his predecessor would have resolved them in a more conventional fashion. Dolphy, like Bird before him, was devoted to understanding music theory, or how music is structured and put together, especially in a melodic and harmonic sense. A collection of musical papers owned by Dolphy reveals that the late musician had a voracious appetite for musical knowledge, transcribing Bach's first cello suite for solo bass clarinet and writing out pages of newly created collections of pitches or synthetic scales. One can hear these exploratory sounds in a track by Dolphy, Miss Anne, a sometimes melodically and rhythmically jagged, pointillist, and adventurous musical journey. So be sure to listen to Miss Anne by clicking the listening link in your textbook or finding it on YouTube. This is a page from one of Dolphy's journals. It is important to remember that Dolphy's musical innovation represented an artistic incentive to stretch the limits of what was possible in jazz. This is reflected in the titles of his albums, including Out There and Out to Lunch. Some would argue that Dolphy's embrace of innovation to the point of being considered avant-garde by many represented the counterculture and rebellion of the 1960s. But Dolphy, like Ornette Coleman, did not base his musical innovations on a desire for social change. His goals were purely musical. A classically trained musician studying with some of the finest musicians in Europe, including the preeminent classical flutist Severino Gazzoloni. Dolphy might just as easily have had a career as a classical performer, but his desire to forge a distinctly unique sound and musical approach pushed him towards jazz, an outlet for allowing more musical exploration in the arena of improvisation. There's a listening link in your textbook entitled Gazzoloni by Eric Dolphy. Be worth a listen. Dolphy stands out as one of the greatest improvisers in jazz history for his unbridled creativity. In his interpretation of the standard God Bless the Child, we see Dolphy as both the brilliant analyst and emotionally charged performer, an artist who was capable of seamlessly combining his enormous harmonic intellect with a raw and powerful delivery that retains the catharsis and melodic directness of the original tune. Be sure to listen to God Bless the Child with Eric Dolphy on bass clarinet. There's a link in your textbook. Tragically, Dolphy's life was cut short when he died of a heart attack resulting from a diabetic coma. Pianist Herbie Hancock, a friend and collaborator of Dolphy's, believes assumptions about race cost the life of one of the 20th century's greatest musicians, an observation which has also been supported by Charles Mingus and other musicians. Hancock says, "He collapsed at a show, but when he was taken to the hospital, the medical staff apparently assumed he was on drugs and left him to detox. Eric didn't do drugs. He was diabetic. If he'd gotten a shot of insulin, he might still be alive today, but instead he died in that hospital at just 36 years of age." Yusef Lateef and Rashaan Roland Kirk. Here's Yusef Lateef playing a bamboo flute. Considered both in his lifetime and still today to be an avant-garde musician, Dolphy was one of only many musicians who explored new musical possibilities in the increasingly multicultural and global climate of the early 1960s. The saxophonist, composer, educator, multi-instrumentalist Yusef Lateef was one of the first musicians to actively pursue the idea of world music, an umbrella term still used today to describe music that explores non-Western styles. Lateef also influenced the globally minded New Age genre of music that would emerge in the 1970s. It would have been innovative enough for Lateef to incorporate rhythms and musical scales from Arabic, East Asian, and East African cultures into his music. But Lateef went a step further, also learning and playing instruments from many non-Western cultures, including the bamboo flute, shenai, shofar, argol, sarwa, and Taiwan koto. On the track listed in your textbook, Bamboo Flute Blues, one can hear Lateef fusing elements of East Asian music with American blues. Like Dolphy and Lateef, Rashaan Roland Kirk was a multi-instrumentalist, best known for his ability to play multiple woodwind instruments simultaneously. Some of these instruments were standard jazz instruments, tenor saxophone, flute, but some were less conventional and not even considered traditional instruments, including the stritch, the mancello, and a whistle, as well as everything from alarm clocks to a small electronic box with a tape recording that Kirk referred to as the evil box. Kirk used a virtuosic technique known as circular breathing, which allowed him to keep a constant airflow without any breaks going through his instruments. One can see Kirk's virtuosity and innovative instrumental techniques on the video of his performance of his own composition, Serenade to a Cuckoo. There's a listening link in your textbook. Some critics derided Kirk's music as nothing more than a gimmick, failing to acknowledge the innovative musician's ability to create transcendent music using unconventional instruments and techniques. Indeed, Kirk did not view himself as an entertainer. Rather, he identified as both a spiritually driven artist and a social activist who used his unorthodox musical approaches to capture people's attention. As a civil rights activist, Kirk would often intersperse anecdotes about his experiences with racism and discuss civil rights during his concerts. His work in the civil rights movement expanded beyond the musical venues and jazz clubs and into American mainstream television in the early 1970s, when he protested the absence of African American jazz musicians on major network television shows. Kirk's activism, while largely ignored by a press that sadly labeled him as a showman with an impressive gimmick, was ultimately recognized by one of the most popular late-night television hosts of the early 1970s, Ed Sullivan. In 1971, Ed Sullivan featured Kirk, Mingus, and many other African American jazz musicians in a feature on modern jazz. So listen to Rashawn Roland Kirk and Charles Mingus performing on the Ed Sullivan Show. The link is in your textbook. As of this writing of this textbook, there are African American musicians in jazz and a variety of genres writing powerful music to protest the continued systemic oppression and marginalization of Black people in the United States. Terence Blanchard's composition, Breathless, provides a contemporary example of a jazz musician who is continuing the tradition of the civil rights era jazz musicians in order to work towards an end to racial injustice towards African Americans in the United States. There are two listening links in your textbook. One is Terence Blanchard describing the inspiration behind his composition, and the other is the tune Breathless by Terence Blanchard. Glossary: absolute music. Music with no underlying social or political agenda. Altered refers to a changed note among the extensions or added notes of a chord. Bass clarinet. Larger, deeper sounding member of the clarinet family. Brown versus Board of Education. 1954 Supreme Court ruling that segregation in American public schools was illegal. Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965. Two important pieces of federal legislature offering African Americans the same rights and protection as white Americans. Civil Rights Movement, 1954 to 1965, a period in American history where African Americans used nonviolent protest and social reform to gain equal rights. Embouchure, use of facial muscles and lips to produce sound on brass and wind instruments. Music theory, a study of the structural elements of music. Pocket cornet, smaller version of the cornet. Synthetic scales, a newly created pitch collection or scale, not based on a previous scale. Significant people: Abbey Lincoln, vocalist. Nina Simone, composer, vocalist, pianist. Charles Mingus, composer, bassist, pianist. Jimmy Knepper, trombonist. Red Norvo, vibraphonist. Tal Farlow, guitarist. Danny Richmond, drummer. Joni Mitchell, singer, songwriter, composer, vocalist, multi-instrumentalist. Ornette Coleman, composer, alto saxophonist, multi-instrumentalist. Charlie Hayden, bassist. Don Cherry, trumpeter. Billy Higgins, drummer. Eric Dolphy, alto saxophonist, flutist, bass clarinetist, composer. Yusef Lateef, composer, educator, multi-instrumentalist. Rashawn Roland Kirk, multi-instrumentalist, composer. Terrence Blanchard, trumpeter, composer.
Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time.